So let's talk about the Local CTF Challenge by Fixitgearware Security, where we are offering a voucher worth $25 of HTV premium subscription. Okay. So we posted this for quite some time, and unfortunately, we came to discover that no one has ever been able to solve this. It is quite, in a way, shows that the profession cybersecurity has really declined because everyone basically is solving challenges that has to do with pawning vulnerable boxes and machines without imbibing the culture of core critical thinking that has to do with computer science, maths, and other concepts. Since we know that cybersecurity has to touch various subject matters. And of course, when it comes to malicious hackers, you know, spreading malwares and multiple EXEs that are malicious by nature, they try to use this concept of various subject matters to obfuscate their payloads, which is not basically just encoding patterns, but involve you solving multiple problem related concepts such as maths, calculus, and so on. So this idea is part of the concept while we alternate our giveaway voucher so that you can infuse that concept of thinking outside the box and having a critical knowledge on how to solve problems and, of course, finding solution. So today we are going to talk about this giveaway voucher, which has not been solved yet, which we intend to do today just to warm you up on how you should expect subsequent giveaways or machines you will pawn that we tend to build for ethical hacking purposes will be modeled. Okay. So on our screen here, you can see the concept of the giveaway to be the Loco CTF Challenge. And the image we posted, we said testing your maths genius. Okay. So reading through the whole gibberish information we posted on X, we have considerably highlighted these various clues within the text. Okay. So I'm not going to read all this text, but I want you to focus on those highlighted, sentences, because these are part of the clue that will give you insight in solving this problem. Now, for example, you can see we talked about how number works, the rhythm of alphabets, the ABC song, the binary functions, the advanced mathematics, and we said one in synergy. So when we talk about synergy, it means everything working as one unit. So if you look at the strings, which we posted for you to crack and review, they all have to be solved and linked to one set of strings that reveals the voucher code. Okay, that's what we mean by synergy. Now, we further highlighted the part where we say characters hold just from A's to Z's and ones and zeros. Everything we deal with comes to computer science. Okay, then that these can give us an understanding on how to solve everything that seems difficult but easy, just like the code below. So basically, what we're trying to say here is that despite this looks so complex or difficult, it's very easy to solve. Now, if I was to solve this challenge, the first thing I'm going to do is a two-way method. Okay, I can either say first, I go to Google and ask how many strings does a HTTP voucher comprises of. That is one. But taking this route means I have to, see a lot of information which might be comprising of past strings method of vouchers, that hack the box usually, generate when you purchase the subscription. Okay. So these strings might not be the same for the year 2026. Okay. So I might either take this route, or the second route is I will just go to Fixitgearware Security official X handle and search the post of the last voucher string that was posted. Okay. So this is to enable me get the number of characters that this voucher strings comprises of. And of course, make it easy for me to solve the code that was, shared on the latest CTF challenge. Okay. This is just the two simplest way to have an understanding, or should we say, get information that gives us insight that, okay, we are resolving the right strings to generate the voucher activation code. Okay. So as promised, we said we are just going to give clue by solving some part of the voucher and leaving you to figure out the rest. Okay. So for example, we have 0-19.8.25. Now, 0 hyphen means 0. It's an entity of its own. Okay. So we made it in such a way that we divided it in a serial key format. So the hyphen is just to separate two different strings. Okay. Now, the focus is the dot. Okay. So if you're familiar with maths, dot is considered as multiplication. So whenever you see dot, it means multiplication. Or let's say 2 enclosed bracket with a number. Okay. It also means multiplication. Now, referencing back again, there's a character holds just from A's to Z's and 1 and zeros, right? So if I say 0 hyphen 19 in alphabet, what does 19 hold? S. Now, dot in the same alphabet, what does the number 8 holds? H. Then we have a dot 2, but 2 is not emphasized, but 5 is. So in the alphabet, what does 5 hold? Letter E. Now, if we put this together, we have OSH to E, which is the first segment of the voucher. Now, looking at the crack me to reveal me, the places we highlighted in greens, you can see that they're emphasized. Okay. So that means those are the core strings that you need to solve. And within this crack to reveal me, some of them, especially those in letters, if they contain the initial character highlighted or emphasized, the rest of the characters preceding them are not relevant. Means you have to delete them. Okay? Now, the final clue is, if you're familiar with maths, when you see something like this, it doesn't mean 3 exclamation. It means 3 factorial. Okay? And if you're familiar with permutation, combination, and factorials, you know 3 factorial is equals to 3 times 2 times 1, which is equals to 6. Okay? And if we check on the alphabet combination, what holds 6 is the letter F, right? So this is very easy to solve. You can see there is no encoding. There is no special, like strings or characters that we inserted into this voucher. Okay. The concept of this, the local CTF challenge is just to shake you a bit so you can test how you can be able to critically think and, of course, resolve problems that has to do with solving, pen testing challenges that shows that you do not only learn based on already solved problems, but being able to think outside the box to find solutions to newer problems. Okay, that's how we model this, local CTF challenge. Nothing special, nothing too technical, just simple. So with this clue, I believe and hope you are able to solve the rest of the string and, of course, crack the $25, dollar worth of HTTP voucher. And best of luck to the successful person that resolved this. Now, for our Discord family, sorry, we chose not to display your strings because it's meant for the Discord. But you should ignore, alternating the strings that are emphasized. Okay. For example, within your own solution, I think there is a string that has Facebook in it. So the F and B are emphasized, which means the rest of the strings should be ignored and F and B should be considered as part of the strings that is part of the entire voucher serial key to be used to activate the $25 worth of HTTP subscription. So once again, just should focus on the non-highlighted part to resolve, your solution. And of course, the numbers you get, you can now reference them to the alphabet, to get the corresponding character that matches that number. Okay. For our Discord family, yours might be a bit technical because I think one of the strings comprises of a permutation solution. Okay. But the permutation solution is very easy, which is not difficult. Okay. So just watch this video, follow the concept we've just explained here for our Discord family, and be rest assured that if you are able to solve to a certain extent and share to us the string, if we check and it's just one or two mistakes you make, the first to do that, we will just share the complete voucher to you. Okay, so best of luck to the guys who are going to give it a try. And we hope that you win this and expect more technical concept in our subsequent giveaway, which not only involves solving these clues, but also finding what part of a vulnerable machines we hit the various clues that you can connect the pieces together and, of course, get a HTTP subscription worth of vouchers. Okay. And one more thing, as time goes on, we might decide to make some of these vouchers to be like 3-month subscriptions. Okay. If we intend to make it more complex so that at the end of the day, the difficulties or the stress which you have gone through to solve these problems will be worth it. Okay. So that's all for this week. As we promised, we decided to make this short video. We hope and wish you the best of luck in solving this challenge. Thank you and bye for now.